Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we're joined by John Rossant. He is the founder and chairman of the NewCities Foundation and CEO of CoMotion. John, thank you for joining the show.
Hey, thanks a lot, Joe. It's great to be with you. Love what you're doing, by the way.
Yeah, likewise. Your organization is huge in the space, and it's one of the biggest markets out there. But for our listeners who aren't intimately familiar, what is the NewCities Foundation?
Well, the NewCities Foundation, we're a nonprofit research organization. We're headquartered now in Montreal, Quebec, in Canada. Our team had been actually based in Paris for the first few years of our life. And then we migrated over the Atlantic to Montreal. We basically got an offer from the good folks at the city who they have a policy to attract multilateral organizations to Montreal, and we scouted out the place. We loved it. It's a very young city, full of talent, and so we've been very happy campers there. We founded it about 10 or 11 years ago. At the time, I had been in charge of producing the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland every year, every January, and also all other World Economic Forum events. And it was really at the time when I personally began to be more and more focused intellectually on the sort of problematic of cities. You'll remember, I'm sure, that about 12 years ago, the human population passed the 50% mark. 50%, more than half of the human population is now urban. The statistics, everybody quotes them. We're heading to a planet that is really an urban planet. And I felt that, that phenomenon, coupled with the digital revolution and new connectivity technologies, that the sort of impact of those two massive megatrends is going to be really important and would be kind of the next big thing. I think it was really just before people uttered the word smart city, which I think first was sort of popularized by IBM and Siemens and et cetera. So in Davos, I kind of felt that there was sort of insufficient focus on urban questions, on cities. I mean, the core unit that is dealt with at the World Economic Forum is very much the city-state, is very much the nation-state rather than the city. So I felt, there's really room for a new entity that helps public sector stakeholders, private sector stakeholders work together to improve the city. I mean, the city as a construct doesn't belong to anybody, it belongs to all of us. And I think, those urban experiments which work best are those where you have public and private collaborating, very aligned on issues. So I think, in some cities where there is not that alignment, you don't have a successful city. Successful cities are where the public, private, labor unions, research community are broadly aligned on taking the city forward. So we do, we work with lots of companies who are present in the urban space, whether it's sort of Google, Engie in France, or Transdev, sort of mobility space. We work obviously with a lot of public sector institutions, and we tend to look at particular issues which we feel are somewhat underserved. So, we don't want to kind of reinvent the wheel and repeat what others have done. So we tend to identify issues that, we think are challenges or problems that where, by bringing together a really good or few private sector partners with a city, we can accomplish something. So, examples of areas that we focused on over the past few years have been, for example, new models for financing urban infrastructure. There's huge pools of capital out in the world, whether it's pension funds or whatever. There's a massive need to invest in infrastructure, and the typical ways that you finance that are becoming increasingly outmoded. And so we engaged one of the top experts in the field, Julie Kim from Stanford, to do a sort of one-year study at the foundation, which Citibank helped support, and Arup, the engineering architectural firm, to look at new models of urban infrastructure finance. And so things like CPAC bonds, which have been developed in Brazil, or different kinds of user fees and things like that. So that was really interesting. We're looking a lot at housing, the future of housing, affordable housing, and access to affordable housing is a massive issue in just about every city on the planet, and not only kind of New York and San Francisco, but it's a priority in Miami and Paris and Beijing, etc. So we've organized a whole series of conferences, first around North America and Canada, but we'll extend it elsewhere in the world, looking at this issue, but bringing in sort of prop tech players, community groups, again, the financial piece, and AI. Speaking about artificial intelligence, by the way, we've done a lot of work on how AI is being increasingly used to supply urban services. We held a big conference in Paris last year on that. Then another sort of broad area that we look at is urban well-being. And we feel, for example, we never talk about smart cities anymore at NewCities Foundation, but about well-being. We feel that it brings the conversation back to humans, which is,
Do you mind going into why you don't use the term smart cities? I find that incredibly interesting.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's been a few years since we banished those words from our institutional vocabulary at NewCities Foundation. We felt that it is, for a variety of reasons. One, it's too technological an approach. It reduces everything to technology rather than to humans. And I think for that alone, we said, let's not say that anymore. And also, I think it's one of those terms that has been so overused that it's really lost significance. And, for many, it was, actually the term was, pretty much popularized by IBM. I think going back sort of 10 or 15 years, there's sort of, a smarter planet, smarter cities, smart cities. And it was a kind of convenient catch-all phrase to describe what was then that very centralized IBM type approach, which came to fruition, for example, in several cities around the world, like Rio, where you have a kind of centralized command center that organizes traffic, sewage, feedback loops with citizens, etc. It's very kind of 20th century, I would say, approach to the city rather than 21st century. Very expensive. I mean, it was hugely expensive, for Rio and for Brazil. I don't think they could really afford it at the time. And cities don't have to be smart in that sort of centralized command center type way.
So what's the antithesis of a smart city then, if we're going in a different direction?
Look, I think we're getting there in the sense that what we find over and over again now in the urban space is that for the last decade or so, I would say cities have been somewhat passive spectators and actors when it came to the sort of introduction of new kinds of technology in cities. So, and what I mean by that, if you just take the transit mobility space, 8 years ago, an Uber sort of burst out of San Francisco, where they were a startup, and basically started operations in cities in New York, in Los Angeles, and San Francisco. There was no regulatory framework. City transit agencies had absolutely no idea how to deal with this new kind of company, that network company that didn't really have employees, gig workers, etc. Was massively disruptive of the taxi medallions and stuff like that. Same thing happened in city after city, starting where I am now in Los Angeles and Santa Monica with Bird, the dawn of micromobility 4 years ago, where a Bird just burst out of nowhere, and suddenly the sidewalks and streets were alive with these weird electric scooters that were causing accidents. There was no regulatory framework. There was cities didn't understand what to do with them. Paris, as of last year, had 12 micromobility operators, and it was crazy. And you saw that in city after city. What's been happening at a kind of really very quickened pace now is that cities are getting really smart. And they're getting their kind of technological chops, and they're understanding the role of data, how to work with data, etc. And so can begin to speak with some of these operators as kind of peers. So that's a really interesting. So cities are getting smarter everywhere. I mean, mayors are getting smarter. We just did a big conference. It was virtual, but in Miami. And if you take someone like Carlos Jimenez, who's the mayor of Miami-Dade County, it's a very big, city. That's the biggest city in Florida. And he used to run the fire department. The guy is a tech whiz. He loves speaking for hours about electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft and the promise of urban aerial mobility at scale. And I see this over and over again. It's not falling in love with technology, but it's learning to be conversant in it. And I think it's just making for a much more interesting urban space. And I think you find that really around the world. The other thing, and this goes back to the universe that you inhabit, Joe, is right from the beginning of the NewCities Foundation, we also had a focus on, as our name would suggest, on new cities, on big greenfield cities, projects around the world. And it's not a phenomenon, as you know, that we have so much in North America. We're largely very urbanized in North America. In the sort of 50s, 60s, we had things like, Reston, Virginia, a very successful example of a greenfield city, big new communities in Florida and Arizona. But these vast new cities we see now are coming to life in the Middle East, in South Asia, India, China, where you do have this massive tsunami of populations becoming urbanized. So you have to literally build new cities for them. And that's become a very interesting space. So about 4 years ago, we launched something called the Greenfield Cities Alliance, which is a loose grouping of the largest greenfield city projects in the world. So it's sort of New Cairo, NEOM, new cities in Malaysia, etc. And so that's the idea behind it, is that the people behind these new cities, whether it's the architects, the master planners, the managers, etc., can exchange best practices, look at, what works, what doesn't. One of the things about building a city from scratch is that, the track record is not particularly good. And, there are white elephants out there. It's, city is a hard thing to create from scratch, create inorganically. The city is something that grows organically over time. But, we have to find ways to create new cities now because we have, people have to go somewhere to live, and we need them. We need to develop new parts of the world, etc. So that's a very that's also an exciting part of what we do.
So what are some best practices to avoid some of that centrally planned type of thinking that you mentioned with smart cities in regards to greenfield cities and new cities? How can we avoid them becoming white elephants and boondoggles?
Yeah, that's a $250 billion question. I think flexibility is probably one way you can do that, in the sense that if you have a master plan, and you say, okay, and after 5 years we'll have 150,000 people. 6 years we're going to have 600,000 people, and 1 million people in 10 years. And here are the freeways. To plan everything, you have to do that, because a master plan is a master plan. But you have to have the flexibility to adjust it and to correct course. And I think cities that are able to do that tend to succeed better than cities that don't, that have everything, it's rigid, we're not going to change anything, etc. So I think I can give you an example. I mean, we did a lot of work in a place called King Abdullah Economic City, which is sort of a long word, a long title, but it's a completely new greenfield city on the Red Sea coast, about 150 kilometers or so north of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Now, Jeddah is the kind of commercial capital of Saudi Arabia, old city. Its port is sort of really silted up. A lot of the sort of younger, young families were kind of looking to fleeing because the services are pretty crappy, etc. And so the decision was made to build an entirely new city to the north, and build a completely new container port. I mean, one of the reasons is that because Saudi Arabia doesn't have good ports on its Red Sea coast, everything had to be trucked in across the Arabian Peninsula from Dubai, which is not even in Saudi Arabia. So they wanted, sort of a container port on the Red Sea coast. And so a big port was built, and they planned for a city that, within 10 years would have a population of 2 million. And, they're nowhere near that. But they had the intelligence and the flexibility to kind of reassess their plans and, plan for a smaller residential footprint. And, it's successful now for what it is. So I think it's important to be flexible and to, change course slightly. Otherwise, I mean, there are always black swans and strange developments, and, and sort of, macro environment, whether it's, economic downturns or wars or whatever. So you have to do that. And I think, cities that, again, I haven't been able to, and there's some glaring examples. For example, in China, really real white elephant cities that have just been built, and very few people live there. And, these broad sort of avenues with no cars, pretty depressing places.
I agree. It's difficult if there's these large infrastructure projects that aren't accounting for the demand of the population, and there's hardware infrastructure, like the actual physical infrastructure, and there is the software, so to speak, either the laws or the actual software that helps govern the city. What are examples of new innovations in governance or in technology that are helping govern the hardware of cities?
Well, look, I think when you're building a new city, you want to make it a really attractive place for people to come and live, and attractive not only in the sense of physically attractive, and that's very important, but also that there's a regulatory framework that is very attractive, and that is conducive to innovation, to company creation, to things like that. So I'm involved in a very big Greenfield city project, also in Saudi Arabia, by the way, called NEOM. It's one of the biggest Greenfield city projects in the world. And right from the start, we realized that we had to have a completely fresh and differentiated legal framework from the rest of Saudi Arabia. So and a lot of effort was spent looking at best practices for company creation, looking at Singapore, Israel, other geographies around the world. And I think some of the best legal minds in the world were sort of engaged over the last year and a half in producing what is essentially a new constitution for a new country. And I think you'll be reading about some of the things about NEOM pretty shortly, but I think that's important. If you're going to build a city, you've got to make it a kind of sexy, attractive place for smart people to come and live and work there.
Yeah, I mean, NEOM is one of these biggest projects in the space. It made a splash in the zone industry, new city industry, a couple of years ago, and people haven't stopped talking about it. I'd love to hear how you got involved in the project to begin with.
The government approached me kind of early on and asked me to be one of their advisors, and so I'm a member of the sort of International Advisory Board. And it's a great advisory board. I mean, there's Masayoshi Son from SoftBank, it's Robbie Spire, the head of Tishman Spire, Andrew Liveris, the former chairman of Dow Chemical, my friend Carlo Ratti from MIT, the architect, and a bunch of others. And we meet every few months. And look, I was very happy to be part of this. I mean, it's one of the most interesting new urban experiments in the world. And in a country that's rapidly evolving, very young demographic profile there. I mean, the average age is around 20. So, very open to innovation. So no, it's been a great experience. And I think, if you look at it, it's the first big planned city of the 21st century that takes into account, this is how I view it, the two key kind of mega trends of our new era. And I think one of them is certainly the sort of energy transition. I mean, the move away from hydrocarbon and carbon-based sort of energy sources, because we have to do that. We have to decarbonize, our cities, our industries. And two, it's, I think, the first big city urban project anywhere that takes into account what is the mobility revolution, and that is the fact that in a very short number of years, 2, 3, 4 years, we'll have robo-taxis, autonomous vehicles at scale, certainly urban air mobility, so electric autonomous air taxis that will sort of zoom you around a city. I mean, we are absolutely at the threshold of that era. And so NEOM is the first city anywhere that's been designed around those concepts. So, it will be completely zero emission. They're not planned to have any at all internal combustion engines. There'll be a lot of use of autonomous shuttles, autonomous taxis, things like this. So it's very exciting.
It's incredibly ambitious, and it's one of the it probably is the most exciting thing in the zone space and new city space. There has been some concerns that very much similar to criticisms you've had about sort of over planning associated with the project. We have a lot of technology for flying cars and automatic taxis, but when people see things about giant artificial moons and all the sort of shiny things around there, they don't want it to be like a Chinese ghost city out there in the middle of the desert. What are some ways that are to address those concerns?
So I think a lot of effort has been put into, again, ways to make NEOM attractive to knowledge workers, to digital nomads. So in terms of, it will be extremely easy to create your company in NEOM. Fiscally will be very, very interesting in terms of running costs. Things like electricity, et cetera, will be almost free. All of the energy and electricity at NEOM will be derived from renewable sources. One of the interesting things about NEOM is that it has a really unbeatable combination of very strong and consistent solar radiation during the day and very strong winds along the Red Sea coast at night. So in terms of producing electricity, it's golden. There are actually very few geographies in the world that have that combination. Western Australia is one. And so I think you'll see at NEOM, as you do in that part of Australia, the development of hydrogen-based industries. And the great thing about hydrogen is it's completely non-polluting. It does not emit any carbon. And so, it will be very interesting. But I think that, and also, in terms of it's where it is geographically, it's in the northwest quadrant of Saudi Arabia. So it's right across from Egypt. It's 50 kilometers from the Israeli border. It's, 150 kilometers or so from the Mediterranean. So it's much more part of the kind of Eastern Mediterranean space than it is of the Persian Gulf. And so, it's a less than 3 hour flight to Rome, a 3 hour flight to Paris. So it's also a lot of completely untouched, beautiful land, whether it's mountains or coral reefs. What I think is, for me, so attractive and compelling about the place is that there's very, very clear policy to protect that. So to make sure that the reefs are protected, the urbanization plan, which will be revealed fairly soon, so I can't give up too many details, but it leaves 98% of the land of NEOM, which again is huge, it's the size of Belgium, or the size of Israel, completely untouched, and will remain untouched and undeveloped. And I think, in people in our world, which has become crowded and developed, etc., I think, we look to that, we want that. So, we want a place where you can breathe good air, there are no traffic jams, there's no pollution. So I think it's a quality of life also that can be quite attractive there compared to, some other urban zones I can think of.
Yeah, could you talk about that a little bit? I know that Hong Kong, it has a beautiful incorporation of nature into its cities. Obviously, New York is very famous for its Central Park. How will this city incorporate nature into its its
Well, again, I can't reveal too much, but I think there was a basic principle that you will, anywhere you are in NEOM, in the urbanized part of NEOM, you will be a short walk away from complete nature. So, and I can't really go into too many details, but you'll believe it when you see it. And I think it's probably the first and only city I can think of that's been imagined in that way. So it's again, it's this NEOM is the size of a small country. Only a small part of it will be actually urbanized in the way we think of urbanization. The buildings and streets and things like that. Everywhere else will be completely left as is. And so it's a pretty new concept of the sun, we'll see. I mean, I think in the next, we have to attract people there, and there will be lots of campaigns to do that. But I think for a number of people, it can be a quite interesting proposition.
very interesting. And so what are some of the motivations behind it? Sorry that we're digging so deep into this particular project, just so interesting, but
Yeah.
what are the motivations behind building the city? Is it Saudi Arabia trying to diversify the economy? Is it their answer to Dubai? Do they just want to build a city? What's the impetus?
I think it's part of what's called the Vision 2030, which is a plan to post-oil Saudi Arabia. I mean, up until now, it's been an economy that is completely dependent on the hydrocarbon sector. Pumping out crude oil, refining it, etc. I mean, that's the big industry there, and that's not going to last forever. We're clearly at the going into the last chapter of the hydrocarbon age. Thank God for the planet. So they have very ambitious plans to launch creative industries, robotics, things like this. And I think the authorities felt that it would be very useful to have a completely blank slate instead of sort of retrofitting one of the existing big urban areas like Riyadh, the capital, or Jeddah, etc. Just start from scratch. At the same time, there was also a desire to develop this corner of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that has not been developed at all over the decades and decades. Very, very sparsely populated, but in a incredibly important strategic location. So it's at the border of Jordan, Israel, and Egypt, near the Mediterranean. It sits astride one of the main sort of shipping routes in the world that goes through the Suez Canal. So it's strategically very, very important. I think probably for reasons you can appreciate, I think they don't actually say it, but I think the idea, you have a huge, big, high-tech Silicon Valley powerhouse in the area called Israel. And so I think the idea of building a sort of tech-based urban space, near Israel is kind of a way to look at, a way to imagine what a future of the Middle East can be. So it's interesting on all sorts of levels. The key is going to be attracting companies and people to set up shop there. So So we'll see.
So we're closing up soon, but for the last question, and I like what you said,
Yeah.
they're trying to replicate a Silicon Valley model. In a world that is increasingly looking post-Silicon Valley, there's going to be a lot of attempts to create new Silicon Valleys. And I think we're already starting to see it, the beginnings of a new city bubble, or not a bubble, at least increased demand. Maybe it'll become a bubble at a certain point. But because there's such a movement towards it, it's increasingly important for people like yourself with the network and best practices in mind to sort of state what you think should be sort of the ground rules or best practices for them to follow. So for our listeners who may be working on such projects, as they're moving into this space, what general advice can you give them to make sure that their project is satisfying actual needs versus a future buzzword?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't have the magic answer, Joe, unfortunately, for your listeners. I mean, I do know that I think, again, a constitutional / regulatory framework that is open to company creation, has a light fiscal touch, that reduces radically, the bureaucratic steps to, approving companies or projects. That's really important. The rule of law is also really important. You need, a legal framework that is respected and is adhered to and is sort of backed up by the highest authorities in whatever country it is. I find, investors like rule, like a solid legal framework. You need that. That's sort of the sine qua non, I think. Obviously, access to higher education is important. And, I think you mentioned Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley would not exist if Stanford didn't exist. Here, where I'm based in Los Angeles, where we have Silicon Beach. It's Caltech, USC, UCLA, etc. And universities are really important. And it doesn't mean necessarily that a university has to be at the core of a city, but adjacent or have connections, etc. Very, very important. Going in, that's where a lot of innovation happens, and you bring in young people, talent, and things like that. So universities are important. Sort of. The other thing I think is important is, on the transportation side, is you want to have a good airport and good connections. And if you're going to build a city in the middle of nowhere, make sure you build a good airport, because the last thing you want is to be in the middle of nowhere. I guess you want to be able to get out and come back with ease, etc. So yeah, I mean, those are some of the basics. But I mean, it's look, I think the whole saga of city building in the 21st century is going to be an amazing one, because it's the first century in human existence that will be a totally urban century. We need to get our cities right. It's where we live, and we have what are we, 7 billion. We're gonna be a more and more populated planet, so we have to organize human beings into cities. They have to be havens of well-being. You have to feel good. You have to make sure that the sort of work-life balance in cities is good. You have to worry, I think, this is something we face in North America. I mean, the real wealth disparities we're seeing in cities. The Gini coefficient, is kind of off the charts in a lot of places. That's worrying. I'm an American. I'm worried about that. I think we have to sort of get that under control one way or the other. And yeah, It's but you know, I love cities. I grew up in one. You know, I live in one, and you know, they're the greatest places on earth.
We're living in the age of the city, and if you want to be part of that age, help join John Rossant at the NewCities Foundation's many exciting initiatives. And John, thank you so much for joining the call and just telling everyone about your exciting work.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.